Father Joseph Tuscon. Welcome to Power and Witness. And I just wanted to ask you some questions about your work. You gave us a retreat, was it this past year, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to believe time flies. And you're a Capuchin Franciscan. And first, I'd like to just start a little bit with your history and your initial work there in Papua New Guinea. But where did you grow up?
I grew up in Canton, Ohio, Mother Angelica's hometown. And as a young boy, I was the altar boy for the nuns' convent mass at Santa Clara in Canton. And so I knew Mother probably since I was 18 years old. And so I grew up there. I entered the Capuchins that cover my region of the country in Ohio, centered in Pittsburgh. And they had a parish in Dover, Ohio for 120 years, St. Joseph's in Dover. And Father Angelo Shaughnessy was stationed there back in the 1950s before he went over to Papua New Guinea. And that's how he got to know Mother Angelica before she came down here to Alabama. And they stayed in touch over the years. But Father would come up to Canton for retreats for the nuns, and he was, I think, the first Capuchin I met when I was 17. But then later, when I was in college at the University of Akron, one of the extern sisters there, Sister Mary Bernadette, was the extern, and I was sort of talking to her about discerning a vocation, and she recommended the Capuchins. And so I entered in 1989. I went to the seminary 1987, and then I entered the order in 89, first vows in 1990, final vows 93, ordained a priest in 97, and then was right off to Papua New Guinea by 1998.
Okay.
So
did you meet Mother in Canton?
I did.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. She used to come up in the summers for home visits.
Oh.
And I would, I think I first met her in my first year in the seminary, or maybe even before I went to the seminary. I was on my way and she was at the family home in Canton, and we went over to see her. And of course, house was full of people, and she was, at the table with everybody telling stories, and there was no room to sit down. So they gave me a plate of spaghetti, and I'm sitting on the steps to the second floor of the house, and somebody must have told her that I was going to the seminary, and she got up from the table and came over and sat down with me on the step and got to know me, and then we stayed in touch over the years. And then I worked on Rhoda Wise's cause up in Canton for 7 years. So I was on the board until we got the diocesan phase of her process for looking into her possible canonization. When we closed the diocesan phase, I went off the board, but I very familiar also with the Rhoda Wise house and grotto.
Okay. So you went to high school seminary?
I did not. I went to a public high school in Canton, and then I was at the University of Akron for a year before I made a discernment to give the seminary a try, and went to our seminary in Pittsburgh, closed in 1980, St. Fidelis, and we combined our students with the Diocese of Cleveland at Borromeo Seminary in those years. And now it's the Center for Pastoral Leadership in Wickliffe, Ohio. But I graduated from Borromeo Seminary in 1989, and my graduate studies were in Washington, D.C.
And do you remember anything Mother said, or what was any characteristic that struck you in those meetings that you...
With her?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, she was just very full of energy and full of ideas, and things were booming. I remember once being down here, and it was after one of the first strokes, and we were sitting in the parlor together and talking about all the things that had happened over the years with her from the time she grew up in Canton and came down here and all of that. And she said to me, "Honey, God had a plan for my life. I was along for the ride."
Yeah.
And so she very much saw all of this as, she unexpected, totally unexpected. She just there was a famous story of her attending a parish mission that was at St. Peter's in downtown Canton when she was just a girl, and a gentleman that we knew very well for many years, who lived to be 100 years old, told the story that they were having a veneration of the cross, and at that time they'd come along the communion rail and bring the crucifix, and when it came to young Rita Rizzo, she just wrapped her arms, passionately kissing the crucifix, which was so unusual. But she had just recovered, from her ptosis of the stomach, and it was, she was in the process of discerning her own vocation. She was just on fire for Jesus, and I think that was really her characteristic her whole life. She just passionately loved Jesus and did everything for him, and the fruit of that, her commitment, her perseverance, her wit, her enthusiasm, all came from that very Franciscan charism of affect for God, love for Jesus especially, and I think that's where it came from.
Yeah. And shaping our personality too. I mean, she's a child of divorce, but what about the Italian community there in Canton?
Mm-hmm.
What was that like? I know that's kind of before your time, but
right. Well, my grandparents were married where she was from St. Anthony's.
Okay.
My grandparents were married there in 1925, and so it's from the Italian community was all really basically from that parish. Okay. Even though my family didn't live in that parish, we lived elsewhere, but very familiar with St. Anthony's, and at that time, the mafia, the Black Hand, and things was very active in that area, and that had a lot to do with the story. There was a priest that was killed at the parish famously by the mafia, and he was killed doing a baptism. A woman shot him, point blank, and at the doors of the church, and it just, it was kind of a rough and tumble period in those years, and then because of the killing of the priest, and because he was moving the site of the church, he wanted to move it away from the old school because the mob was using the school to keep alcohol and they were using it as a hiding place, and they were going to be losing the property if he moved it. So that's, I think, why he was in the end killed. But the story lingers long in the parish. And but I would say, aside from all of that, it was a community of very deep faith at the same time, interestingly enough, because criminals, what can you do about criminals? But the faithful, my relatives and cousins that all got married down there, and things, they were very, very devout, extremely pious, devout people. And so her life really came out of the context of that both tumultuous but also extremely pious environment,
So there were other Italian parishes in the area? That was the main one? Or
there really weren't other Italian parishes. Okay. I'd say that's the only Italian one.
Okay.
But I mean, there were Italians in other parishes. I mean,
I see.
There were groups of Italians in certainly up in North Canton, St. Paul's in North Canton, because the Hoover Company, there are two big companies in Canton. You had the Hoover Company that made the vacuum cleaners, and then Timken Ball Bearings, a steel company in Canton. And you had Italian families working for both companies, so they were all over.
Yeah, I guess, because I always wondered too, like with Steubenville, people talk about the mafia there, and today you look at it and you say, why in the world would mafia be there? But I guess back then, that was a great shipping crossroads, right? Trains and stuff would go through. I mean, all the industry in Ohio too.
Absolutely, steel. And then, of course, down there they had Coke, the Coke stacks and things down there in
Okay.
Steubenville.
Okay.
But a lot of steel workers still, even in that area.
Yeah.
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 Mhm.
Well, let's talk about Papua New Guinea. It's so fascinating. That was your first priestly assignment?
It was.
Yeah. So can you give us a little history and the call to the Capuchins to evangelize and what was the culture like at that when the Capuchins first went in?
Yeah. Well, our province was originally from Bavaria, Germany, so from the Shrine of Altetting in southern Germany. And they arrived in Pittsburgh at St. Augustine Parish in 1873.
So that Pope Benedict talked a lot about that. That's a Marian shrine, right?
Not only did he talk about it, he served Mass for our priors.
Oh, really? Okay.
There's a famous saint, one of them, it was the most famous Marian shrine in Europe before Lourdes, the Shrine of Altetting.
Oh.
Germany, and there's still pilgrimages there.
Uh-huh.
And so when he was a boy, Pope Benedict, he lived near the shrine in Altetting, and he used to serve Mass for our Capuchin friars there. And there's a very famous saint in Germany, St. Conrad of Partsum, who is a Capuchin, and he was the porter at the shrine there in Altetting, Germany. And in fact, he said that he would pray for us and for our mission. He sort of sent, when the missionaries left Germany, to come to Pittsburgh, and he has been the patron of our novitiate house ever since. It's named St. Conrad. And then our province went from Washington, D.C. to Victoria, Kansas at one time, and then it split in the early 1970s, and the Mid-America province, as it's known now, took the name of St. Conrad of Partsum. So our founders were missionaries to this country. And then in the early 1900s, there was some request starting from Rome to our province to send missionaries again, because we built a seminary, we were starting to get vocations. But we were still just barely producing enough vocations for our own national needs here in the United States. But there was a big push for missionaries. So we first sent missionaries to China, and they were expelled during the Cultural Revolution in 1949. But interestingly enough, now we have a friar back in China. Now he's Father Keon, who's getting a degree in canon law right now because the bishop in China needed a canon lawyer. So he's, but we actually, there is a small Capuchin presence in one of the provinces in China. But so our first missionary effort was rebuffed, but we had been asked to take Puerto Rico as a mission territory in 1930. Because after the Spanish-American War, the U.S. president wanted the Spanish-speaking missionaries replaced with English-speaking American missionaries. So the Spanish Capuchins, who had been there for a couple hundred years, had to go back to Spain, and then our province took Puerto Rico in 1930. They also asked us to take Guam and Hawaii, but our provincial declined because we had just taken Puerto Rico, and that was given to the New York province. So Capuchins from New York were in Hawaii and in Guam. And then in 1951, another request came, and our provincial said, well, that they didn't feel that we were really ready for another mission, but or had the manpower for it, because it was before the big boom of vocations in the early 1960s. But anyway, a second letter came arriving, making the request, and the provincial, Father Victor Green at the time, agreed, and he said, well, give us the hardest mission you have. And so the South Pacific island of New Guinea, which was divided in colonial times between three colonial powers. The island, the western half of the island would be now part of Indonesia. It's called West Papua. It was formerly under the Dutch. I think it was called Dutch New Guinea. And then the half of the island that is toward, is going east, it was divided north and south. The Germans had a territory in the north called Papua, and the British had the southern half of that part of the island, and that was called New Guinea, and it was run by the British. So they obtained independence in the early 1970s, and it was placed under colonial administration, those two territories, under Australia, and it was called Papua New Guinea. In 1951, though, the territory was considered uninhabited before World War II. In fact, when the request came from Rome to our superior in Pittsburgh, they got out the world map to find it. And there was an interesting word written over the southern Highlands province, which was the mountainous interior of the island that we were being asked to go to. And the word on the map was uninhabited. So those parts of New Guinea were literally undiscovered until after the Second World War by outsiders. So when our friars finally arrived there in 1955, we had sent some men up to Catholic University to study how to learn ancient tribal languages. Spent a couple years doing that, and then they arrived there in 1955 and began, and it was absolutely from scratch. So they would first go with the Australian Bush Patrol officers who were taking a census of the population. And if the government patrol officers were Catholic, they'd take a priest with them. If they were Protestant, they typically took a Lutheran minister with them. And so that's how the mission slowly got established and up there in the mountains. And then, and in the very beginning, they would only let the friars walk a mile radius around the patrol camp because they didn't know what was beyond there. And then the other issue, of course, was the languages, of which there are 700 distinct vernacular languages in the island and another 150 dialects. So 850 languages on average, they say. And our diocese, which is now Mendi, which is the Southern Highlands province, there are 80 vernacular languages in the diocese. In the parish that I worked in the Kagwa parish, we had 80 chapels and in the parish, and we were 3 priests. So we were taking care of basically a diocese, the 3 of us. And in the parish, we had 5 dialects of the Kawa language in the parish. So from one end of the parish to the other, the people couldn't really communicate in their own language with each other. So they have a national language called Pidgin that I also speak.
And what was the estimate, like in the 50s, what was the estimated population?
Well, even now, it's only about, just for some perspective, the island's about the size of California. They have a population of about 4.5 million people. And so they're just, for perspective, there's 10 million people in Manhattan on a work day. So you have an enormous landmass. It's the second largest island in the world, and a population of less than half of Manhattan.
I'm just looking at the map. It's really close to Australia.
About 100 miles. It's called the Torres Strait. It's a little bit of water there in between Australia.
And today, like, there is like a big city there and stuff?
The capital of Port Moresby is a city that you might expect to see things that you'd see in any sort of large city. And then the other larger cities, Madang might be the next largest city, which is up in the northern coast. And then there's some more, Lae, Papua New Guinea would be a fairly large city. Those are port cities, and they have lots of natural resources. So they have gold, copper, oil, silver, timber, so all these wonderful hardwoods, teak and mahogany, and so they're just very rich in natural resources. The soil is volcanic, and it's so rich that when they plant sweet potatoes, all they do is they stick the vine of the sweet potato directly in the soil and it grows. The soil's incredibly rich, but it's very unstable, the ground, and so there's a lot of mudslides, and always the roads are always difficult, especially in the rural areas, because of the instability of the new ground that it is.
So the colonial times, they had established the beginnings of these cities, right?
Yes.
On the coast. Yeah.
Right. Port Moresby was established by the British.
Okay.
Yeah.
But so you all the Capuchins went into the interior, and what did they find? What was the culture like in 1950s?
Well, they call them Melanesians. So you have Polynesians, Micronesians. They're called Melanesian. They are ethnically African. Anthropologists believe their bloodlines go to Madagascar, which is an island off of the Horn of Africa. And because it was an island, this is thousands of years ago, but they made their way on boats up the coast of Asia and onto the islands of New Guinea thousands of years ago, and then maybe a bit later up into the mountains.
Now that would be distinct from like the Indonesian.
Right. So the Indonesians are Asian, and physical characteristics of Asians. The Melanesians look African.
Okay.
And even there's a little different look from the people that live out on the islands and the coast, even from the people that live up in the mountains, they're built differently. The people in the mountains have typically bigger legs, stronger legs, and the people on the coast tend to be tall and thin. And the people in the mountains tend to be more muscular and things like that, and a little bit shorter. So there's some like physical differences, and if you live there, you can almost tell where people are from.
Now, people from Madagascar, they like went up like around India and came down from Thailand and.
Must have, they made their boats. So, however, they managed to sail up there and then settled in the islands, and then. The culture had, they were hunter-gatherers, is the way the story goes, originally. But what happened was when the Portuguese were exploring Asia, they first stopped in South America, and they picked up sweet potatoes from South America, and they had them on the ships. And they took them, they were first trading up in the Japanese islands, the Portuguese, and they traded the sweet potato to the Asians in like Japan and those islands up there. But what happened was, before any Westerner ever set foot in the New Guinea Islands, the sweet potato made its way down the coast by trading. And totally, they called it the sweet potato revolution, because they went from being hunter-gatherers to farmers. It had a lot of implications, because when you were hunter-gatherers, you didn't have to claim land. But if you're going to farm, you have to claim land as your own, and then you have to defend it. So the advantage to having a stable a source of food was that you could grow wealth, you could have more children, you could feed more of your animals, but when claim to land became part of the culture, so did tribal fighting, fighting over the land, and so it changed the culture, the sweet potato, and so there were. Their religious background was that they were animist. They called them nature religions. So like the Native American Indians would have versions of this type of religion. But even, pagan Europeans and Celts and things like these were all nature-based religions. And so they wouldn't have had a sense of like a single God, but they would have had like spirits, spirit world, and then they also had a cult of worship around their ancestors. And in fact, they had never seen white skin before. And so when we arrived there, they thought we were ghosts of their ancestors, actually, come back to bring good things for them and things. And, but they were simple, but they were not unintelligent. And so they cut up pretty quickly to, Western, like how motors work and how, I mean, they were actually very bright people. But they were just isolated from the rest of the world for thousands of years.
Was there problems like with diseases being introduced, or from the Western?
From the Westerners?
Yeah.
Not so much. No, there isn't a lot. Yeah, like what happened in the Caribbean and things like that from the European explorers. I don't think so, because it was so gradual. It wasn't like they were inundated all of a sudden by Westerners. There were, in fact, it was kind of in reverse. The Westerners would get sick from tropical diseases there. So yellow fever, dengue fever, malaria, TB, typhoid, hepatitis. And so a lot of our friars had gotten those when they got there.
Yeah.
But I don't think the disease, like we didn't, it wasn't like what happened in the Caribbean. People didn't die from getting contact with, it was, measles though was there. But I mean, I think that would have been, I think that would have been there anyway. One of the things that their religious tradition was that whatever the spirits were over there, they didn't have a sense of them being like friendly. I mean, some of them were like, maybe, I don't know, you could say easier to get along with, but the religious rituals usually had to do with placating the spirit world, or manipulating them, or convincing them to do something for you. And they would sell rituals. Like if something they did ritually worked, they'd say, well, the spirits listened to that. So they would sell that ritual to another tribe and teach them how to do it. And they'd pay money for that, things. There was a good deal of tribal fighting between them because of land, and also over women or pigs, which was the source of wealth in the culture.
I just wanted to ask you really about that too. I remember Father Angelus talking about the pig. I would, but they have other meat sources? I mean, coming from a hunter-gatherer at one point, but it sounded like pig was the thing, wasn't it?
As far as meat goes, I mean, there were some very limited there's a type of cassowary bird over there that in Pidgin they call a maruk. In fact, their football team is named the Mendi Maruks. So it's a very aggressive bird. It's a sort of a short ostrich, but those are more rare. And then some snake. There's like a big boa constrictor snake, and sometimes they would eat those. But and the eggs from the cassowary bird, that was another source of protein. But those were very limited protein sources. The main source of meat protein were pigs. And they didn't have other animals really there. And so the Australians were trying to introduce cattle projects, and we actually helped with that. We had cattle projects there in the early days of the mission. It was helped by the Australian government. And then also sheep. So they got used to mutton. But for them, pig was a very expensive, very precious. It's a very sweet meat when you cook it, bacon, basically. And so it was different from even, beef from a cow or, mutton from sheep. It's a very highly prized animal. And in the early days they'd only had one word for an animal about the size of a dog. Mena was the word in Kewa for that. And in our mass, in the local language there, they would say in the mass for the Lamb of God, they'd say got mena sip sip nyana maya me rumbaya. which basically is translated as pig of God. You take away the sins of the world. Which the problem with that is that pigs don't follow the voice of the pig herder, right? And all the imagery around the lamb and all that stuff, it's kind of lost because they never knew what a sheep was,
So I found it interesting, hearing you talk about this before, that they had no concept of a merciful, loving God,
Right.
forgiving.
Well, so the other characteristics of their culture were that their marriage custom was polygamy. And this is where a young girl, young teenager, would be, basically you had to pay for your brides. You had to pay a bride price. And they also understood intuitively over the centuries that you don't marry people too close to their bloodlines. Mm-hmm. So often the girls were sold off to tribes that were at a great distance, and they didn't know the man they were being married off to. And if the man could afford to have wives, meant he was older. Yeah. So, and the men didn't live with their wives. The men all lived together in the center of the village in a big long house. Mm-hmm. When the boy and when you purchased a wife, your job was to build a little round hut for each wife, and then the man had to break up the hard ground around it so she could plant a garden, grow sweet potatoes to feed the tribe. Mm-hmm. And then when the girls would stay with their mom until they were teenagers, then they'd be sold off by the men of the village. And then the boys, when they were weaned, they would go live with the men. And so that was their marriage custom for thousands of years. And then the other probably characteristic of Melanesian culture at the time, aside from the tribal fighting and the many languages, was cannibalism, which, and in fairness, I would say this is, they didn't eat human flesh as a staple food. It was ritualized. So you basically, you're conquering your enemy, and then you're cannibalizing like the leader on the other side in order to get his power. Like, so, and I would just, without, too much, I would say this about pre-Christian or pagan culture in Melanesia prior to evangelization, was that we look at that, and certainly the word cannibalism, and even they're horrified by the history of it, and they would certainly often embarrassed by that history, but it was part of the history. The Catechism of the Catholic Church calls polygamy an aberration of the natural law. So it's a sin according to nature, but it's an aberration. It's not in God's original plan of the complementarity of husband and wife. And in fact, we call the mission in Papua New Guinea the miracle mission, because we could, far from us like imposing Catholicism on, the noble savages of the mountains of New Guinea, we couldn't keep up with them because we only sent 5 priests, and they regularly were coming to the mission station from remote villages to take us out to their village to tell them the Christian story and to have mass and to tell. And here's what it was. When they there were, in fairness, there were a number of things involved. Okay, like one of them was cargo. There are famous books written about the cargo cults of the South Pacific. Like there were cults, especially in the islands, that literally worshipped cargo. Okay, so because for them, their religions were to get like it to rain, or to stop raining, or to make the ground fertile, or something. So their religions had a practical aspect. And when they saw Westerners come in with all this equipment and vehicles and electric generators, you must have a powerful God. Tell us about him. So there was a little bit of that element of like rice bowl Christian thing. Like they wanted us to come because they thought they were going to get some development or like some things out of it, or they were curious about this powerful God of this religion that could make all this stuff. So there was an element of that. But that quickly wore off because, as I said, they were simple. They were not unintelligent. But what really, in the end, was a source of religious conversion for the people was the family. because when they found out that Catholic marriage was that you marry somebody your own age who you choose and love, and you live in the same house with them and raise your own children together. I mean, the girls were, the young girls were like, tell us more about that.
Mm-hmm.
And even the boys, because the boys couldn't even hope to have a wife until they were older, and could afford to purchase, the wives. So it was, you could say it was love that converted New Guinea.
Wow.
Because when they first heard of what Catholic marriage was, that is not a source of philosophical or theological imposition. That is a liberating message from what they had experienced that liberate the human heart, right? So in a certain sense, you could say it was love that converted New Guinea. But there was something deeper that happened, and this was that in all their languages and dialects, not one of them had a word for forgiveness. And that's because the concept of forgiveness does not exist in natural law. Natural instinct is, if you hurt me, I destroy you. That's instinct, right? We're going to hear the gospel tomorrow morning about an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, which is a refinement of natural justice. Mm-hmm. That is, so that if somebody hurts you, you only take what was taken from you. But the problem with the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, of course, is that the tension still remains, right? Among the people, there's never an ability to have a fresh start. There's just everyone had words for payoff and payback, compensation, retribution, but nobody had a word for forgiveness. And they looked for it, but they realized it just doesn't exist in natural law. The concept.
And I remember you telling us, even like the pictures from that early time, like because there was so much, I guess, fighting between the tribes, like people's expression were like had a fear about that.
Oh, well, sure. I probably, that's probably a dominating thing in the early days, was that the Melanesian culture was characterized by fear. Fear of each other. So the reason they spoke all these different languages was not just that the island was big and that they lived, distance from each other, but they also feared each other. And that's why they had all this tribal fighting. And so the reason they had all these different languages, they literally didn't talk to each other. And then even within the tribes, behavior was controlled very tightly with fear. So if you did something wrong, or you would be punished publicly, corporally, and immediately, usually. And the girls, if two young people committed a sin against, for instance, the sixth commandment, the girls, like in our Lord's day, would be stoned to death. They would be killed, and not the boy, because the girls were purchased, right? So they literally had no rights over their own body because they had been purchased. They didn't bother the boys. The boys were actually trained to be aggressive toward women, and even they had prayers in the old pagan days about making the boys arrogant and headstrong, so that they were aggressive. Because if you're trying to fight against your enemies, you don't want weak, effeminate men. Right. You want aggressive fighters. Right. So they were aggressive, and they were generally expected to kind of go after women. But if the women got caught, if they got caught in that act, the women would be killed.
Now, because would that, like, the father couldn't sell them later? Say it was a teenage girl.
Yeah.
If she was caught in an act of adultery, whatever you call it, but she couldn't be sold later. Or?
Well, if she was already involved physically with someone, in their mind that is a marriage. Okay. So if she was unmarried and she committed a sin against Sixth Commandment with a young man, they would consider that married, and then you'd have to work out the bride price. Oh. Right? Because we call that act the marital act, right? Oh. That is what defines marriage. In fact, the word matrimonium in Latin comes from two roots: mater, woman, and monium, meaning the state in which that it's possible to become a mother. So the word marriage is defined by that act. So like it's interesting in our day, we talk about the definition of marriage. Well, marriage is already defined by its own word. It is that state in which a woman can become a mother, right? So if she was already married and did that act, she would be killed. If she was already unmarried, the negotiation would just be to paying the bride price for her. Okay, but there could be violence over that because girls didn't make their decisions about who to marry in those days. That was made for them. So there could be violence between the two tribes because of that violation of the cultural norm. But anyway, the point there is that fear did rule. And in the early pictures of the local people in Papua New Guinea, when our friars first went there, the pictures, they looked angry. And they weren't angry. They were scared to death. They were scared of us. They were scared of each other. They were certainly, where it came from really was the fear of the other world, because they didn't have an incarnate God who told them that God was a father and loved you, right? And so that's what. So marriage was the first step into Catholicism, but that just getting into that structure of marriage isn't what sustained the conversion.
Well, let me ask you this first. Was there like
Yeah.
pushback from the older guys that the status quo guys, the young people want to get married, the older guys saying, hey, we're controlling this. How did they overcome that?
They kept the bride price. So even though you have Christian marriage, you still had to pay a bride price.
Okay.
So because when you had a girl, that the expectation culturally was that you would get a bride price for her. So even though they were now being married as Christians, the boys still have to pay a bride price for their wives.
And they got rid of the polygamy quickly, or?
Well, yeah, polygamy fell away because it was expressed to them that there's a exclusivity in God's plan, original plan for marriage. Talked about Adam and Eve, and that that was what God originally planned. So if you had, for instance, in the early days when you had men that were chiefs and maybe had 7 or 8 wives, they would pick, if they wanted to become Christians, they would have to pick one of the wives that they would be in a conjugal relationship, but they would have to take care of the other women, or they would have to give them money compensation because they couldn't be married again. Culturally, nobody would marry them again. So he would typically keep the wives in order to provide for them, but he would select one of the wives that would, usually the first wife, and she would be in the Christian marriage with him. And then the other wives would be provided for, but he wouldn't be living, as a married man with them. And that was in the very early stages of the mission.
Okay.
And then now they mostly are married as Christians. They don't go through all of that because they don't have polygamous marriages anymore. But they still have to be married by custom first, usually, which means the bride price has to be paid off.
Yeah.
So that's how they, and eventually, and today, I mean, a lot of the younger people, they can't wait till they can just get married without the bride price thing. In some of the bigger cities, that's starting to happen. But you have ironic situations now where, for instance, like the girl, in the old days, the girls weren't educated, but now some of them, they become nurses or teachers, and they have a paycheck, and maybe they're marrying a local boy who's their age, who they love, but he doesn't have a job. So I had several situations when I was a pastor where the girl paid her own bride price to her parents, because essentially what the bride price is now for girls that have gone to school is you're paying the parents back for her education.
Right.
So basically, I had situations now where you have women who have an income, and they want to marry a village man who doesn't, And so they pay their own bride price in order to be married. So it's that, but it's changing very quickly now. And, that's, I think many of them are, can't wait till the day when they just don't have to do that. But it's still a cultural expectation.
I guess we should say you were there from what year to what year?
I was there from 1998 to 2001, so about 4 years.
Okay.
And I was pastor of an area called Sumi in the Mendi Diocese, and I had 17 chapels, 17 villages on my own. I had a school with 600 children in it, and I built a convent for the local sisters. And but half of my chapels were at least 2 days walking to get to Mass, and then a day out and a day back, walking up through the mountains. And
then
then
motorcycle for some.
we had motorcycles for some of it. You could use the motorcycles, but we used a Jeep type vehicle called a Suzuki Samurai. That was our mission work vehicle. But just on the broader level, culturally with them, what happened was that because of this, the idea that there was no word for forgiveness in the culture, early on, the priests realized, the missionaries realized that they had to find some way to communicate that concept to the people. And because it's really at the heart of the gospel. I mean, if you can't answer that question, because in their minds, they were like, well, we understand the concept, but what's in it for you? I mean, why would you, for what reason would you do that? Yeah. Would you forgive somebody? And that had to be answered. So they looked around in the culture and they found a custom that they could make an analogy with, and that was that if two tribes had wanted to settle fighting between them permanently, there was a custom that was very costly that they would carry out that would settle fighting forever between them. And it was a form of exchange, and it usually had to do with the death. So if somebody was killed, like in a tribal fight, they'd say, well, that was an injustice. We took a life, we'll replace it. We took a person, we'll give you a person, okay? And so, but it wasn't an adult, because an adult would have a memory, harbor resentment. It was a child. It was a newborn infant. And the infant was called the child of peace. The idea was, we're giving you our own flesh and blood. Be raised in your tribe, intermarry with you. And if we ever fight again, we'll be spilling our own blood, because now in that child we're mixed, right? So if they did that, those two tribes would never fight again. So the missionaries saw that, and they said, this is a start. And they said, God the Father sends his Son as a baby, as an infant, into our world. And in the Holy Eucharist, his flesh and blood become mixed with us. And this gives us several things. First of all, a knowledge of God, because he is Emmanuel, he's with us. And then he tells us about the nature of God. In fact, he clarified our misunderstandings about God's nature, that he's not vicious, that we don't have to live in servile fear, that the filial fear of the Lord is not that God is wicked, but that I can be because of my sins. I can turn my back on his love, right? He's called Abba, a loving father, like a father loves his child. And in the end, that's what converted New Guinea. It was the end of cannibalism. It was the end of polygamous marriages. It was the end of tribal fighting as it had existed at the time. Yeah. They're still fighting there at times in tribes, but they're over different things now. It's usually over politics. In the old days, they fought over land, pigs, and women. And now almost always, if there's a tribal fight, it's over politics and money. Okay, but anyway, they really went from fear to love. And there's no one in Melanesia that has nostalgia for cannibalism or polygamous marriages or the fear that they used to live under. Right. I mean, if you ask them, everybody has problems. We have problems, they have problems. But on the whole, it was a sea change in the culture. And no one wants to go back to the way it was before, And so you can see the power of the gospel. Cardinal Sarah published a book in 2019 called The Day Is Now Far Spent. And he says this is his most important book. But not long ago, he said this, that when a culture gives up on Jesus, it doesn't become neutral to religion, like I'm spiritual but not religious kind of thing. It returns inevitably to the patterns of paganism, right? So there isn't a neutral.
Right.
You know, Padre Pio said we're either moving toward God or away from him, right? So if you look at our culture, when I was a pastor in New Guinea with my people up in the mountains of New Guinea, I tried to explain to them some things about my own country and culture and the church here. And we got talking about abortion one day, and they couldn't understand the concept, because in their culture, if you kill somebody that's innocent, they would consider you cursed for life. If for no reason you just took somebody's life, let alone a child, they would consider you cursed. So they were asking me, they were trying to understand it, and they said, and I was trying to be fair. I mean, I don't agree with the pro-abortion position, but I was trying to help them understand it in the context of our culture. But they said, well, what did the baby do? And I said, no, it's an unborn child. They said, oh, the mother, because they're trying to rationalize, like, why would you do this? The mother did something. You're punishing her. They said, what did she do?
Yeah.
I said, no. She wants to do it. And they literally, and no matter how I tried to explain it, they literally were horrified by this. And yet, they're the savages. I would tell you, abortion is far more common in our culture than cannibalism ever was in theirs. Right. And the people that were killed and cannibalized were not innocent. They were war fighters.
Well,
so
that's kind of amazing that like their pre-Christian culture had a respect for life. Like you'd be cursed if you killed. I would think the opposite would have happened, but
no. In fact, on a natural level, there was a lot of natural virtue in Papua New Guinea, and they were farmers. So, like any agrarian society, they had the Asian thing also with shame. So they didn't want to create. If you took shame publicly, I mean, it's social death. So they tried to be careful with how they spoke, and they would speak metaphorically in language. They called it in Pidgin Talk Baucus. They speak in metaphors. So it's not to just like, zing somebody right between the eyes.
It's like Southern culture.
Yeah, right. And they're gracious, and they're trying. They tried to subsist, and I mean, you couldn't always control young people that could be violent at times, but on the whole, they're just a farming culture, decent people. Really, even before Christianity, you could have said they were very, very decent souls on a natural level there. But, again, the culture was still driven by this fear that was relieved by Christianity.
I'm guessing, too, just like the natural value of these realities of marriage, of family, of children, of human life, I guess it does make sense that in a kind of very basic culture, those things would come and the value of that would stand out just from a natural law perspective, I guess you'd say. But it's weird how we're blinded to the value of human life.
Well, think about that true in this context. In our culture, what is the primary institution that is under the primary cultural assault at the moment?
Marriage.
Marriage and the family. Yeah. Even defining it, right? Even the effort to redefine it.
Yeah.
But just even the concept. And I would say in particular women. Because when a culture devolves, it is women who get the short end of the stick.
Right.
I mean, so now you have a situation where young girls that are losing their records and their scholarships, and they're told if they have a problem with being in a locker room with physically intact men, that they should go see a psychologist because they have some kind of psychological problem.
Yeah.
And it just, it isn't women joining the NFL.
Right.
right? And so, you know, you have a situation where we had a Supreme Court justice who was asked the question, what is a woman? And the very forces that were at play culturally that prevented her from just answering that question in a straightforward way, that is itself a demonstration of the cultural devolution, right?
Yeah.
And then so you also see that, so if it was the family that brought them out of really paganism, the concept of Christian family, it is, as the culture devolves, it's the family that's the first to devolve, right? And to dissipate. And it has all kinds of cultural signs that go along with it. Tribalism, you know, people say, well, we don't have tribes here. You know, I'd say we call them Democrats and Republicans. And they're starting to talk in dialects that the other side can't understand anymore, right? You look at polygamy and they say, well, we don't have polygamy, maybe someplace in Utah, something. But for them, as I said earlier, the marital act defines marriage. If you do that, you're married. Now you work out Christian marriage, tribal marriage, common law marriage, whatever you want, but marriage is defined by that act that is able to make a woman a mother. That's literally matrimonium. That's what the word means. Okay, so in our culture, we have what they call the hookup culture, you know, just casual sexual relationships, just simply for the venereal pleasure of it. And then you don't care what happens to the person. You don't even talk to you don't even know where the person goes after that. You don't care about them. So they would call us polygamists, but they would call us irresponsible polygamists. Because in their culture, if you want to have many wives, fine. You want to have 7, 8 wives, fine. But you have to care for them. You have to protect them. You have to provide for them. You know, and they would look at our culture that's so casual with that act and just say, well, they're polygamists, but just irresponsible polygamists.
Yeah.
You know?
I know I've heard people point out, thinkers, I guess, and analysts of the culture, that the technology allows like this imaginary reality, you know, to have sex without having human life, you know, without conceiving, and the transgender movement and stuff. It's like the technology has this big role to play, I think, in trying to give the illusion that this is a new reality.
That's exactly what it is. It's an illusion, because that act itself defines the relationship, defines a marriage. But using like a piece of plastic or something, or a chemical to like prevent what that act is designed to create, that's just like a cop-out. I mean, it's like, you know, you're just then using it for simply for pleasure. In other words, you're using the person. You're just using the person. I mean, so, and again, so you say, you know, but they're the savages, right? At least they took care of their wives, right? They provided for them. They took care of them. They, you know, they were under the jurisdiction of the new tribe. And honestly, you know, I mean, it wasn't all terrible, you know, in the old days, but it just wasn't, when people saw the idea of the personalized concept of marriage with just one man and one woman, I mean, that just, it goes right to the soul, the human soul, the complementarity there. And, you know, and then they'd read St. Paul, where it says, treat your wife as though she was your own flesh. I mean, that was just transforming in Papua New Guinea, because they just didn't look at each other that way. You know, women were property. They were purchased. They were, you know, somewhat of the status of the livestock in a way, because literally the pigs lived with them. And it wasn't uncommon in the old days for a woman to be nursing a baby on one side and a little piglet on the other side, because they were usually purchased with pigs, and they were quina shells and different things, but they were property, you know. And to go from that status to being like a person in a mutual relationship with the man, and that was attractive for both the men and the women. That personalized nature of a covenantal relationship. and not just a contractual sale.
What,
Totally transformed the culture.
were there any? What was their Marian devotion like? Did they really take hold of Marian piety?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Once they got to understand about Mama Maria, that so huge groups dedicated to the Blessed Mother. The feast days of the Blessed Mother are hugely celebrated.
Mm.
I mean, the mother figure in traditional culture is, that she's the ground, right? So that was not something that was hard for them at all. I mean, they took right to Marian devotion
Wow.
very quickly.
Wow.
And so the Legion of Mary is there. Our Christian mothers were there, early on in Papua New Guinea. And but anyway, the concept of motherhood, and it's sacred. Now it's even more than just producing for the tribe. The idea of it that it produced God, that the gift of a woman made the God of the universe, right? Or not uncreated, but the idea that he came from her.
Right.
That just that added to the dignity of women. I mean, the fact that a woman was chosen for this sacred role.
Yeah.
And because a lot of their other myths about creation were they were about deformed men. So that because it was a very male-dominated culture. So they're like for instance, one of the tribes, one of their creation stories was that a young boy. How did you get women? Well, a young boy was climbing up a coconut tree, and he slipped and fell, and as he slid down the tree, his genitals were removed, and that's how you got women.
Yeah.
It was basically a deformed man.
But some of the ancient Greeks kind of held that too.
Yeah,
Women.
it was very. I
funny.
mean, womanhood, like as like the idea of the concept of femininity and the gift of the procreative power of women was subordinate in that sense to that it was a man.
Yeah.
It was just basically a man who,
Yeah.
not a separate complementary being.
So if we could just say it in plain English, today it's like Christianity, Catholicism is accused of being anti-woman. I mean, I literally just heard this the other day about abortion. Some comedian was saying this, and but Christianity has upheld women. And in the scriptures, right, we see Jesus raising the dignity, culturally speaking. He's talking to women here. He's got the holy women accompany him, and of course, the Marian side of things. Right. So there's this lifting up of women that happens just part and parcel of Christianity.
Absolutely. And even if you think of it in practical terms, just genetically, there's more women than men. Okay? So just numerically, most abortions are the victim of the abortion are almost, in more cases than not, they're women that are being aborted.
Right.
So, I mean, you could say, who upholds the dignity of women? Like, are you talking about the women that are being killed in abortion? I mean, is it better, greater dignity to take their lives so they don't even get a chance to be born? I mean, most of the abortions, those are feminine children. Is that kind toward women?
Right.
So, and then also, you could say, well, let's make exceptions, like for rape and incest and things like that. So, is it the child that rapes the mother? Is the child the aggressor? Is the child, do they have to pay the capital crime? They have to pay with their life because of what their father did?
Right.
When in any other situation, there's still laws that I think many jurisdictions would like to get rid of, where if you kill a pregnant woman, you're liable for 2 murders, double murder. Okay, but somehow it's so subjective. There's just, how do you define it? If a woman decides, well, it is actually a person, then it's not a murder.
Right.
But yet the law says in another case with the same woman, same pregnant woman, in another case, it's 2 murders. I mean, there's so many contradictions, in the law. But because what they're trying to contradict is nature itself.
Yeah.
It's a rebellion against nature itself.
Right.
And in Papua New Guinea, they lived very close to nature. And that's why a lot of the things that we do that are so dehumanizing in our culture would have just been like inconceivable there,
Yeah.
you know.
You know, one thing I find interesting speaking with you, and like I said, you gave us a retreat this past year. You know, just to be able to be a pastor, 17 places you had to go to, you had to be very creative, inventive. You couldn't be like, what do you call it, a real rule-bound type guy, right? You had to have some flexibility.
Right.
But, you know, you have a great love for the liturgy. I think you celebrate both forms of the Mass and things. And so how did it shape your priesthood? Because what are the positive things that being a missionary helped you?
Well, I mean, I grew up in Canton with the Poor Clare nuns, and we had very reverent liturgies, even though, you know, it was a time of great sort of devolution in the liturgy in our parish. It was becoming very progressive. Most of my life growing up was the very devotional environment of Santa Clara Monastery, with May crownings and Eucharistic processions and Corpus Christi, which was so big there. And we had very reverent, even though they wrote Novus Ordo masses, and they were then in the early days we were still using a communion rail. People were still kneeling when I was, as an altar boy, we used a communion rail still, even with the English Mass. And so, and I had a very devotional family. My father was very devout Catholic, and, you know, my mother and dad were members of the Third Order of St. Francis for years. So I was raised in that context, and like Mother Angelica in the devotional Italian-American milieu of this country. And I became a priest because of my love for the Eucharist, you know, and my love for the liturgy. And even when I was in Papua New Guinea, we did, you know, a very reverent, I think, with the liturgy. We had all, you know, boys serving at the altar, and, you know, we got cassocks for them and surplices, and, you know, even though it was in their language and Kewa at the time. But I remember thinking, you know, in the early days of the mission, of course, in the 1950s, the Mass was the old Mass in Latin. And when the missionaries, because nobody was baptized at that time, they would just come and sit around, you know, with the feathers and the grass skirts and, you know, traditional clothes. And they'd sit on an open field, and the priest would celebrate a Mass on a temporary, you know, portable altar. And then after the Mass, that's the way it began, was they would try and explain the Mass to the people. And then they give some points about Catholicism, and then, you know, we call those patrols. You'd stay for a few days, and then you'd move on. Well, in those early days, the people that came to the Mass were, in many cases, often from remote villages and even enemy tribes. But they would come because, you know, the missionary was the biggest show in town, right? And so they just wanted to come and see this, and they'd sit there together. Well, once they started asking to be baptized, and they started having baptism, and they were now receiving communion together at these Masses, they, you know, somehow with this baptism, you know, we might be from enemy tribes, but somehow now we're in the same tribe. And the commonality of the ritual and the commonality of a neutral language, because the Latin language, and this is even in the documents of the Second Vatican Council, which claim this advantage of the Latin language, even in the document Sacrosanctum Concilium, that the Latin is to be preserved in the Latin Rite. Why? Because that ritual and that language you can liken to kind of like a Catholic school uniform. It wasn't that it's old-fashioned or nostalgic. It was that it was neutral. You know, and in a church that has thousands and thousands of, tens of thousands of vernacular languages, you know, you could have people from different skin colors and different tongues and stuff like that, and have an ability through a common ritual and a common language to be able to pray together, no matter where you were in any place. And
if I could just say something, I remember you told me that before, and I would sometimes wonder, like, the success of these old world missionaries going into these countries. You know, now we emphasize enculturation so much, and their language, celebrating Mass, and all that's great. But yeah, the fact that you had this one language for the liturgy, all these other different dialects
Right.
could come and worship together.
Well, there was a story about the African bishops at the Second Vatican Council, and when they heard that they were going to start to be able to use vernacular language for the liturgy, they were thinking, oh, well, that's great. I mean, why did we have, for instance, black cardinals anyway at Vatican II? Because it never mattered what your skin color was. I mean, that old ritual and that language was the definition of inclusion, right? And there was a thing about Latin too that, I mean, who was the expert par excellence in it? Everybody knew it better or worse, and you had to approach the liturgy with a certain humility, because you could be from Germany or from Italy or from France, be on the altar with an African priest, and he might know Latin better than you do. And so it was an equalizer, but also it was a uniter, across cultures. And in fact, when we started translating the Mass in Papua New Guinea to the local dialects and languages, it divided the people, because they stopped coming together for Mass, and we'd say, well, why, I'm just in this next village, why don't you come for the Mass? And they'd say, Father, well, we don't speak that language, and we never liked those people anyway.
Right.
So it stirred up, the vernacular stirred up again all these very divisions and all this stuff among the people. I mean, now they're using Pidgin for the masses in the mission, but Pidgin is not a vernacular language. It's nobody's vernacular. It's an invented language. It's by definition not a vernacular. So it was a language that was used to just communicate intertribally, but they still, for instance, they don't pray in Pidgin individually. Maybe some individual people do, but the thing that's very telling, and I asked some of our even recent missionaries there, I said, do people go to confession in Pidgin? They said, oh, no. They go in their tribal languages, because that's the language they express themselves, and that's the language that, they speak to God in, is the language that's your vernacular language. But in terms of liturgical usage, the advantage of that ritual, again, was not that it was nostalgic, it's just that it was neutral. And it was inclusive by definition. And that was and you saw the success of those early missions all along. And I would say, even now, the Latin Mass apostolates that I still have the privilege of working in, you see, it's even in our culture that's becoming so secularized, who are coming to these young people. The Latin Mass parish that our bishop in Pittsburgh established, there's 1,300 people there on Sunday morning. The average age is 31. It's re-evangelized. It has the power to re-evangelize, because these young people are coming, they're rediscovering it, and they're going out to their secular peers and their non-Christian, non-Catholic peers, that you've got to come see this. It's so beautiful. And they come and they stay and they learn about the truth of the faith as well as its beauty. And there's a power to that ritual that just speaks for itself. And it was true in Papua New Guinea, even way back when. And
they took hold of the real presence, that concept of...
Absolutely. Absolutely. That was not hard for them, because and you could say, like, even in the early Christian days, we were accused of being what? Cannibals. And you had to explain, well, no, it's not like that. But they have a very deep and profound understanding of, because of that, the peace child concept. This God who took on real flesh, and is being consumed now in this sacramental way. And there are people in Papua New Guinea of some of the most profound faith that I've ever seen anywhere in the world. And they're good people. They really are. They're very good people.
Well, that's a good... I do want to talk a little bit. I know you're exhausted. You got a big day tomorrow.
Okay. That's all right.
Let's talk a little about... I think that's a great segue point of... you're the director of the Archconfraternity, the Director General of the Archconfraternity of Christian Mothers. All over the world, right? You work with mothers. What is what is some of the spirituality? What are they hungry for? What helps them?
So the Confraternity of Christian Mothers started in France. Next year we're going to celebrate its 175th anniversary. It started in 1850 in Lille, France, north of Paris. There was a women's congress, and the question before them was that after the French Revolution, the Catholic faith had been made illegal. Priests were executed for celebrating Mass. The formal catechesis of children in any formal public way was stopped. And you had these Catholic families that were trying to preserve the faith. So the women were getting together, started to get together, and they said, well, what can we do? And they started this pattern where they would get together once a month and just give each other parenting advice. They'd give each other clues on, they'd help each other with catechesis with their children. They would give each other spousal advice. A lot of them were newly married young women. And then they would pray. They had developed a set of prayers. They developed a special devotion to Our Lady of Sorrows because many of their sons were often involved in the Napoleonic Wars, and they were sometimes killed. So there was a statue of the Pietà in the church where they were praying in the early days, and the Michelangelo's Pietà became the icon of the movement early on. We're almost 100% sure that one of our early actual members was the mother of the little flower, Azalie Martin. We know that she came to the early meetings and that she engaged it, and she talked in the third person as though, we are doing this. And we have some, things of her speaking in that way that she was a member. But she was certainly, we're looking for the actual membership card, but I'm not the director of the Christian Mothers for the whole world, but I have jurisdiction over the United States, which was given to one of our priests in Pittsburgh, Capuchins, by Pope Leo XIII in 1881. So what happened was that some movement started in France, went from Lille to Paris, and the parish Archconfraternity still exists. And recently, Cardinal Sarrat was with them and gave a talk to them. He's kind of a patron for them in Paris. And anyway, it spread from France all over Europe, the European countries. It was like the movement just caught on everywhere. Made it into Germany, and the early part of the 1800s, during what was called the Cultural Revolution, or the Kulturkampf in Germany, it was sort of the German mimicking of the French Revolution, where the Kaiser Wilhelm was secularizing many of the Catholic institutions. There were a lot of anti-Catholic laws being put in place. And that's when a lot of the German immigrants moved to the United States. They settled in different places. There's a group called the Volgadeutsch that settled out on the big farms in Kansas, and they have all these wheat farms out there. And they were part of our province. Out in Victoria, Kansas. And then a group settled in Pittsburgh to work in the steel mills. And they settled in the borough of Lawrenceville, where our mother house is there at St. Augustine's. And in 1873, we got established on that block by the Bishop of Pittsburgh to work with the German immigrants. And the German women had remembered the start of the confraternity in Germany before they came. They had got it already started when they got there. Then our friars started working with them as the director, and then in 1881, Pope Leo XIII raised St. Augustine Parish to an archconfraternity, which gave it jurisdiction to spread the movement across the country and also into Canada and U.S. territories, so Guam, Hawaii, Puerto Rico. And so I have jurisdiction in French and English Canada and North America, basically. And over the years, over 5,000 groups have been established from Maine to California. It's very strong in Guam and Hawaii, where it started in 1948, right after World War II. And it's in every parish in Guam and the South Marianas Islands of Tinian and Saipan. And it's in Honolulu. Also, we have a group in Honolulu. We used to have 7 confraternities in Honolulu. and we're reestablishing it in a couple places in Puerto Rico again. So it was originally started to build up the family. So as the culture in Europe was devolving after the French Revolution, this was a movement to restore the family. And the spirituality is that. So the promotion of women, and any woman can join. They don't have to be married or have children. If it's any practicing Catholic woman, 18 years of age or older, can join the confraternity. But with the specific aim to rebuild the culture through the rebuilding of the family. And so they have prayer. They have a devotional book that was first published in 1880 in German called Mother Love. And we just have a brand new edition that we, after 4.5 years of working, we have a new edition of. It's been revised about every 10 years. Beautiful new edition of Mother Love that we just published, which is online. Our website is just christianmothers.org. And a lot of this history is on there about the Christian Mothers. And all of our groups, current and former, are on their website, active and inactive groups. A number of the groups became inactive after Vatican II. So the movement kind of waned a little bit in some places, but it's actually growing again. In my tenure so far of maybe 6 years, I've been doing it, 5 years. I'd say on average we get about 6 or 7 new groups every year starting around the country. And as I said, in the old days, these were mostly the parochial school mothers. Now it's a mix of things. You have it's not like a third order, so it doesn't require. It's mostly something that women do at home, and it doesn't have years of formation. If you're a Catholic woman, practicing Catholic, you can join if you're 18 or over. And so it gives a little bit more depth and charism than just like a mom's group or a play group. And yet it's not so involved that it takes women out of the home. Right. You know, so some devotional groups or third orders, they are, almost seems to be designed for women that really don't have 8 children at home that they might be homeschooling, right? So this is designed to be something that they mostly live at home, but they get together still once a month for a mass, a parish mass. So they join together. And then they have a brief, meeting that's like a half of a morning, like a morning period. It usually ends by midday, and then they go. I mean, it's designed to support the family, encourage, inspire women, and support them in their vocation.
And what do you see today, like in Western American culture, like these women that are participating in this? What are they struggling with spiritually, and what resonates with them when you give these retreats and talks to them?
I ask them that question. I've asked them all over the country that question. I said, what is it that you, because honestly it first came from curiosity on my part, because I was surprised that new groups were starting. And so I asked them, what is it why are you doing this, basically? And they would say almost always, it's because we have other women that have our same struggles, that we're united with, that we pray for. It's just the support and encouragement, and also the church has granted many indulgences. Many of the popes were huge supporters of this movement, the Confraternity of Christian Mothers. Pius IX, Pius XII, Leo XIII, all of the modern popes have been incredibly supportive, and they granted indulgences to the Christian mothers for various things. So there's this sense of even extended support from the wider church spiritually for their vocations and what they actually do as women and as mothers. And I think that there's women have this, one of the many great gifts of women is their ability to network with each other, and they're marvelous really at that. And this adds this spiritual dimension that just deepens this natural desire to bond with each other. And now they're bonding in a way has a spiritual component that doesn't take them out of the home.
Right.
So they just it's been an incredible rich tradition of saints. I mean, we're still trying to get the actual signature. We want to see it on a piece of paper that Zelly Martin was a enrolled member, but before we, but like I say, we know that she was at the meetings, and she says that it formed the spirituality of her family. And if you go on the Archconfraternity website in Paris, her picture's on there.
Yeah.
So
Well, certainly you can see it in Saint Therese, like her spiritual maternity and being a patroness of missionaries and taking on the Vietnamese missionary. I forgot his name, but so clearly she had a strong sense of her spiritual motherhood, Saint Therese.
absolutely, and from her mother,
Yeah.
Zelly Martin, who herself had wanted to be a visitation nun, and like her aunt, was a sister, and her sister, her mom's sister, and but all the girls became religious.
So, what would you say to young women today? It's almost, I don't know, what we see sometimes in the coarsening of our culture. It's like seemingly it's like a rejection of motherhood. It's kind of a celebration of selfishness or whatever, and just we're gonna have the brunches, the endless travel, and all these experiences and everything. But you've been in Papua New Guinea. You've done this work here, and how does motherhood? I think is just part of the woman's heart and speaks to the mother's heart. That's what I want to say is like this is like family is like this premier place where women can thrive. I mean, this is like your spiritual gift package is there in the heart of the home.
Absolutely.
And it's like the temptation, I think, for modern women sometimes in the culture is, you do these other things, these other values, pursue those. But.
Well, you saw the pushback from the famous speech that Harrison Butker gave at Benedictine College recently. I mean, the pushback on that was just really fierce, and it wasn't that he was saying that women can't get educations, but they're saying like, I think his mom is a scientist. She's a physicist or something. His mother's a brilliant professional or something. So it's not a statement against the fact that you might have a profession down the road, but that what is going to be the most important thing that you do? Is it going to be your profession? You see these Hollywood starlets and great public female figures, and they come to the end of their life and they're older. They look back and you ask them when they're interviewed, they say, what is your maybe greatest regret in life? And almost always that I didn't have more children, or that I didn't have any children.
Right.
And none of them say, I wish I had made just one more movie. I wish I just made another $1 million.
Right.
When you look back on your life and you're about to say goodbye, what do you leave to the world except your progeny? And I would say this, that as a church is a collection. What is it on most basic level? A church is a collection of families, okay, and the culture is just an extension of people that worship God, right? Or that as the family goes, so goes the church. As the church goes, so goes the culture. We have, the current statistic is that we have about 341 million people in the United States today. Of that number, do you know how many of them are at any form of public worship on Sundays today? It's about 25 million. That's like less than 7% of the culture is in any kind of worship service on the weekend anymore. John Adams, America's second president, famously said, "Our Constitution was built for a religious and moral people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." That, are the founders of our country didn't want to have a state church, but they had a great fear, and that is that if Americans stopped going to church, that the government would become the religion, because it's the last arbiter of behavior, right? So if you have any doubt that the worst fears of the founders of our country is being realized, go down to family court some morning and sit there and listen to what people argue about in front of judges and lawyers that they used to bring to their clergy and to their relatives. And we're having to reinvent the book of Leviticus in municipalities because people don't have any moral perspectives that would control their behavior that they can't get put in jail for.
Right.
And the problem with civil law is you can make a delinquent parent pay child support, but you can't make the parent love the child and do the things that intuitively a loving parent would do. I'm going to mention this at Mass in the morning. But this is the problem when you give up. Archbishop Sheen said it this way: the more people give up on God, the more they give up on one another. Right? And William Penn in 1668 said, men must be governed by God or they will be ruled by tyrants. And the simple definition of a tyrant is a person with no morals except their own little truth, their own personal truth, and power over you, power over other people, right? It's how many of our leaders today fit the simple definition of tyranny? Because nothing guides their moral behavior except their own little truth. And then they impose that on everybody else. What's worse? Right? So
without that truth and moral law, it's just a power struggle.
It is. It's a will to power. I mean, this was famous with Stalin. Stalin was a seminarian with the Russian Orthodox Church. He lost his faith, caused the deaths of more people in the 20th century, maybe with the exception of Adolf Hitler, than any other single individual. In the news right now is this war between the Ukraine and Russia. If you know history, this is an old pattern. Between 1932 and 1936, Stalin starved between 4 and 6 million Ukrainians to death to put that country under the boot of the Soviet Union, and it worked. And historians tell us, there were more than 10 million people that were killed by him, that most of those through starvation. And Stalin had only will to power. He said, that's the only thing that's real. He said, everything else is just mumbo jumbo, hocus pocus, right? And he said that what's real is either you have power and you impose it on me, or I have power and I impose it on you. He said, everything else is just talking. And but it's funny because his own daughter, her name was Svetlana Alieva, she died a devout, practicing Roman Catholic, in counter-distinction to her father's incomprehensible hatred for God. And Stalin made this family belong to the state. You bore children to belong to the state, right? So you just produced them, but the state was the parent. Because one of the things that in Marxism they had to do was they had to destroy the concept of the family. Right? Because that's where morals are developed. So the state will tell you what morals is. Look what's happening in our culture today through the public school system and all that stuff. They're trying to impose a kind of secular morality that through, political correctness and all this stuff, you hear the language all the time. The Marxists, the Stalinists would have loved that. That's exactly what they did. That was like Marxist propaganda. That's all this is. They're reviving it. But Stalin, even on his deathbed, he was shaking his fist at God, right? To the end defiant. But Stalin famously once said, if I had 10 men like St. Francis of Assisi, I could have conquered the world. Even he knew that holiness was more powerful than his wickedness and pride, which undermined his own ambition. But he just made himself incapable of it. And, so and the society becoming more divided, more violent, more all that, that's a result of giving up on the person of Jesus Christ. It's a result of turning a back on God.
And it seems like women have such a, we're in this age, as Vatican II said, I think it's addressed to women, it's an unprecedented influence that women can have on the culture today. And they are they have this disposition to the most, as I think as John Paul II said, the most loftiest virtues, of
Yes.
faith and charity and things. And so they have such a vital role to play. And I mean, I know a lot of devout women say they can't find husbands, so guys have to, it's a problem for both, right? That the culture lies in the hands of both men and women. And, but I know it's so beautiful, I think, to see mothers and women in the family and things. It's just, there's something otherworldly about it.
Well, you'll see two of them here tomorrow because they've agreed to have my national president from Colorado, Fort Collins, Colorado. Her name is Colleen McDaniel. And our national vice president will be here with her 6 children and her dear husband.
Oh, wow.
And they're going to be on the 2 episodes with Jim and Joy.
Okay.
And they're living examples of this. Colleen is a homeschool mom of 5 boys, and she's a civil lawyer at the same time. She doesn't practice law right now, but she's raising the kids. And and then Jill and Matt have 6 children. They'll be here for the taping. And, it's really what's going to reclaim the culture, reconvert the culture is the family. The family is the bedrock of evangelization. And because it even produces our sacraments, because where do priests come from? Typically, in the old days, we didn't expect to get vocations from a small family, like a nuclear family. If you had 1 or 2 children, it was presumed that they would be with you to take care of you and also to provide grandchildren, right? We never expected in the old days. Most of our vocations to the priesthood and the seminaries and religious houses were from these large Catholic families, which were the norm.
Right.
And if there's a vocation crisis, it's not a vocation. We don't produce them. Priests and nuns don't produce our own successors. It's the families. If there's a crisis in the priesthood, it's in the family.
Yeah.
I mean, in Europe, one of the main reasons why there's so few priests is people aren't having children. Right? And that's even affecting us here. So, I mean, literally our sacraments are being restricted by the restriction of the family. And I would say this too, that just on a practical level, and I work with these big families, homeschool families, have all these kids. When you have, I'm from 2, so this is no slam to small families. I mean, my parents had wanted to have, my mother was the great crisis of her life that she couldn't have more children. She had to have a surgery that she was unable to have children after us. But she wanted to have a larger family. It just wasn't God's plan for them. But I would say this, when you only have 1 or 2 children, everything under the Christmas tree belongs to them, right? And when you have 7 or 8 children, maybe each child gets one thing, okay? And when you're a child and you want a new pair of shoes, but you can't get them because your sister needs braces, you learn how to negotiate your wants and needs off of other people's needs and wants. And you see these homeschool families that large, brothers and sisters, and on a natural level, it's a great start to a life of virtue. I mean, you can be from a large family and be selfish, but it's a lot harder.
Right.
On a practical level, and this is what makes a culture healthy, is people that aren't narcissistic. Where did we get snowflake culture from? It's from the nuclear family, basically. And, and these larger families, by the osmosis of the gift of interacting with your brothers and sisters, it teaches you how to relate in religious life, it teaches you how to relate in culture. You have a greater intuition about how to work with people and how to negotiate relationships with people. And it does that everything has to revolve around me, right? So the family gives to the society more emotionally, psychologically, generally speaking, stable, healthy people.
Right. Well, Father Joseph Tuscon, thank you so much for sharing with us, giving us your time and Keep up the good work, man.
Yeah.
Got a lot of irons in the fire.
Yeah, thank you, Father Mark. It's been a joy to be with you.